Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy that you've joined us today for this session of our summer learning series, which is called JTS Alumni in the World, Scholarship and Impact. Special welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time today. You can see all previous sessions of this and our last 4+ years of Monday learning sessions on the JTS website. So as I've mentioned, in this summer series, we're featuring, we have alumni doing so many different things in the world that we are featuring mostly people working in the academic realm or slightly more broadly in the educational realm. So we're really just absolutely thrilled to have our esteemed alum, Rabbi Shai Held, PhD, who is an alum of the Rabbinical School. He is president and dean of the Hadar Institute, and Tani will introduce him a little more fully later, but his session today is called Judaism Is About Love, which is based on his new book, which we encourage you to buy. I just did. We would love to, we thank everyone for all of the donations you've made. We'd love to bring in some additional sponsorships for later sessions in the series. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with our outstanding scholars and alumni, we would invite you to partner with us by sponsoring the learning session. And we've multiple sponsorship levels, and we're putting information about that in the chat. And I will now turn it over to Tani.
Thank you, Rabbi Engelman. So just to review the format of our session, Rabbi Held will pause for questions during the class. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Engelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Engelman will select a few of the questions to present to Rabbi Held. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in an email that you received this morning, and we'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Rabbi Shai Held, President and Dean of the Hadar Institute. Rabbi Held received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. Rabbi Held is the author of several books, most recently, Judaism Is About Love. And I'm pleased to turn it over to Rabbi Held.
Thank you, Tani. Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Thank you, all of you, for joining us, joining me today. It's really a privilege. So let me just say a few sentences about what I hope to do in the time that we have together. I first want to say really kind of a few sentences of introduction as to how I ended up spending years of my life on this project and what we mean when we talk about love. And then I'd like to spend the bulk of our time diving in to a few sources that I found over the course of my research and writing of this book, kind of unsettled, preoccupied, challenged me. And, you know, hopefully they'll leave you with something provocative to play with, think about, talk to friends and family about. So first, how did I end up writing this book? And, you know, I know some of you have heard me talk about this before, but I'll just to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page here. I'll start with this. You know, there were two experiences that I had about 25 years ago that, in retrospect, really shaped my life in very dramatic ways. I wish I could say that in that moment, I knew that the course of my trajectory had been set. That would be totally untrue. And yet they had a very big impact on me, one of which I write about in the book and one of which I regretfully did not write. The first, which appears on the very first page of the book, is that about a couple of decades ago, I was speaking to a group of senior rabbinical students at JTS. And I said in passing, kind of the discussion was about something else, but I said in passing, Judaism is the story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. to which one of the rabbinical students said, and if I'm honest, a little bit sneeringly, "I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me." And I was really taken aback by that response and honestly a little heartbroken by it. And I can actually remember it like it was yesterday. And I said to him, it's so interesting that when I say that, you hear Christianity, because I was actually very explicitly thinking about the twice a day Jewish liturgy. We say Ahava Rabbah or Ahavat Olam Ahavtanu, with great or enduring love have you loved us. And then immediately we recite Ve'avtat Hashem Elohecha, and you should love the Lord your God. In other words, a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. But if you hear that and the first thing you think of is Christianity, then there's a much deeper and harder conversation we need to have about just how deeply many Jews have internalized a traditional Christian anti-Judaic idea. And we know from historians that Christianity often told a story about how Judaism was a loveless religion and Christianity came into the world to provide an alternative, to tell a story that was about love. And in many ways, this book is the outgrowth of a lot of the work I've been trying to do as an educator for the last couple decades, which is to sort of help Jews reclaim, recenter that which has been kind of shunted aside in a lot of ways by bias against Judaism. That's story number one. Story number two, which I really should have written about in the book, happened a few months later. I was speaking to a group of Christian high school students. And this was the days when in America, you could still coherently describe a group of kids as Protestant. They were 20 high school kids, all of whom had been chosen for this experience that they were having based on their both kind of devout participation in church and their leadership in youth activities. And again, in passing, again, this was not the main topic. I said to the students, remind me, guys, what does Jesus say is the great commandment? And all the hands in the room go up, and I call on one, and he proudly tells me, love of God and love of neighbor. And then totally innocently, I say, and now remind me, what is Jesus quoting? Not a single hand goes up. Not a single hand. It was an amazing experience for me, right? The answer, by the way, is Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Vayikra and Devarim. And it occurred to me in that moment, oh, so the way that the story about Judaism as loveless and replaced by a Christianity that completely introduces love, de novo, if you will, into the world, it's perpetuated by the fact that none of you have any idea what wells Jesus drank from. None of you know where he got the love. None of you know that when he's telling people that love is the center of the Torah, he's talking about the Chumash when he does that. He's talking about the Bible. And that became sort of the secondary audience for this project, which is Christians. My hope, and it's been an incredibly moving experience for me the past few months since this book came out, both speaking at a whole array of Christian seminaries and participating in a lot of Christian podcasts. The number of Christians I have met who very badly want new ways to think and talk about Judaism, but also feel totally unequipped to go about that, the numbers are actually overwhelming, and the experience has been very, very moving. So, again, my primary audience and the primary goal here was to speak to Jews, but I also very much wanted to speak to Christians and kind of help them reimagine the relationship between what Christianity is and what Judaism is. Now, shifting gears for a minute, what do I mean when I talk about love? Or maybe more importantly, what do I think Judaism tends to mean when it talks about love? And here, it's been very important to me to argue that love is not equivalent to an emotion. I'm going to explain what that means in just a moment. But I think it's much more helpful to think about love as an orientation, a way of carrying ourselves in the world, a way of comporting ourselves. My term for this that I always apologize for because it sounds so pretentious, but it really was orienting for me, is that love is an existential posture. It's a way we relate to the world. Or in the language of moral philosophy, love is a disposition to feel certain things and to act in certain ways. Now, a disposition, in order to actually be a disposition, has to manifest at times in emotion or the disposition will fade or perhaps already has. But it is not synonymous with an emotion, meaning I can have a disposition to feel something without that being the thing I'm feeling at that particular moment. And that's crucial to say because you cannot build a spiritual life on an emotion for the simple reason that emotions come and go. Emotions are in and out. Emotions are ephemeral, right? The example of this that I sometimes give at the risk of embarrassing myself is that if you've ever had the experience of waking up in the morning and thinking, oh, I'm so grateful to be alive. Life is such an immense gift. And then 4 minutes later, you're making breakfast and thinking, I rue the day I was born, right? People have moods, right? And those are real. So love is not about feeling the same thing all the time. You can't feel the same thing all the time. But love is about a disposition to feel certain things. That is very important. And I wish I had actually kind of underscored this more in the book. But I want to just say that if you try to build a spiritual life on a feeling, whatever that feeling is, whether it's love or it's gratitude, if you try to build a spiritual life on a feeling, on a perpetual feeling of X, whatever X is, you invite one of two very problematic things to happen. Either people lie to themselves about what they're feeling, and they tell themselves that they feel love all the time, when in fact they're feeling lots of other things. And what you're actually doing is kind of actively undermining self-awareness because people are lying to themselves. Or you cause people to give up because they realistically and rightly say, I can't feel love all the time. That's ridiculous. I'm out. And so if you enable people to think about love as a disposition or an orientation or a posture, on the one hand, you're articulating something very challenging. I mean, this is the orientation of my life. That's a lot to ask. And you're also doing something that I think is profoundly liberating, which is allowing people to feel what they actually feel rather than what they think they're obligated to feel at all times. If this is helpful, I'll just belabor this point for a minute and say, many years ago, working on a different project, I went to the library one day. This is, I have to say, the day when my colleagues began to wonder why I actually draw a salary. I went to the library and I had ordered every self-help book about gratitude that had been published in the United States in the previous 25 years. And, you know, when I got there, I needed like a wheelbarrow, right? And I went to a desk in the library, and I can't say I read all the books, but I turned the pages of a lot of the books and looked around. And I was really struck by how many of them said that the goal was to teach people to feel grateful all the time. And I remember thinking, that's actually unhinged, right? What about when I just found out 5 minutes ago that I'm been diagnosed with cancer? What about when my wife died yesterday? What about when I found out I'm losing my job after 27 years? What about, we could go on and on and on, right? You can't feel grateful all the time. That sounds like something that only happens, with illegal substances. You can't actually do that, right? But what you can have is an orientation to gratitude, right? In the last 9 months, my primary feeling tone has not been gratitude. I like to think that I've still been oriented around gratitude, but a lot of the time I've been feeling grief, bewilderment, lots of other different things too. And so I think this is actually very, very important for thinking realistically about this. The other example that I like to give, because I think some people at least find this helpful, is marriage. Marriage, even very successful marriages, are not built on the feeling of love all the time. They're built on a commitment to love, on a postural love. Some of the time, you just feel tired or grumpy or irritated by the person you work with, or maybe even irritated by your spouse. But you have an orientation to love, a disposition to return to feelings of love and actions of love. And so that's really kind of, introductory point number one, to think about love in what I hope is more sophisticated ways, right? When I talk about loving the neighbor, I'm not talking about walking through the world having a feeling of love all the time, but I am talking about having an orientation or a disposition. The second large point I'd like to make, kind of by way of introduction, is to emphasize that love as I'm using it, and I think love as Judaism really uses it, love is not a particular emotion or posture. It's an umbrella term for a whole series of emotions or postures. And I'll say that it's been helpful to me to discover in recent years that moral philosophers, having nothing to do with religion, moral philosophers have also begun to talk about love this way. They've begun to say, love is not a distinctive feeling. Love is a whole array of different feelings or postures. So that to concretize this for a minute, so it sounds less kind of like airy-fairy. If I talk about loving my daughter and loving the stranger, I'm not talking about the same feeling, right? But both can coherently be described as under a shared umbrella called love. And more than that, certain emotional dispositions and postures that actually we tend to label in different terms, I would also argue fall under the umbrella of what Judaism considers love. Compassion, gratitude, kindness, generosity of spirit, those are all species of love, I think, as Judaism imagines it. One thing that I found really revelatory in my own thinking, and it's kind of ridiculous that it took me so long to have this moment, but I realized as I was working on this book, trying to think about what love is and what love isn't, that in Babylonian Judeo-Aramaic, or less pretentiously, in the language of the Babylonian Talmud, there is no way to distinguish love from compassion, right? The root that means compassion in Aramaic is resh chet mem, as it is in biblical Hebrew, rachamim. The word that means love in Aramaic is rachama, resh chet mem. It's the same word. It's the same root. There is no way to distinguish them. And that's because I think compassion is a species of love. And that's helpful too, I think, because sometimes people say, well, I can't love my neighbor. I mean, I love my wife. I don't love the neighbor. Well, right, but only if you limit love to a particular kind of feeling tone. But if we start think about compassion, care, kindness, then we might actually be able to talk coherently about all kinds, a variety of different kinds of love, which I think is actually potentially kind of just helpful and freeing in thinking about what it means to cultivate a life oriented around love. Okay, with that, let's look at the sources that I shared. I wanted to share with you, first of all, sometimes people approach me and say, Judaism is about love. Where is that sentence from? Where'd you get that from? So first, I should just say before we look at the source, I mean, this is sort of obvious, but I've learned that I need to say this sometimes. That sentence, Judaism is about love, is intended to be a provocation, not a comprehensive thesis. Judaism is not about any one thing. It's about a lot of things, but it is centrally about love, so much so that someone like Rabbi Akiva can say that love of neighbor is the great principle of the Torah, right? So it is very much about love. I'll mention here as a footnote that my colleague, Rabbi Ethan Tucker, said something really interesting after a recent conversation about my book. He said, everyone has misread your title. This is, if any of you have studied with Rabbi Tucker, you'll see this is a classic Ethan Tucker observation. They think that the title is Judaism is about love, but actually the title is Judaism is about love, right? Your point is not that everything in Judaism is about love. It's that love is very central to and at the very heart of the Jewish tradition, and that's what's traditionally been denied. Judaism is, in fact, about love. And I think that that's actually a very astute observation. But when people say to me, where did you get this love thing? Where is this love hypothesis that Judaism is about love? So what I kind of had in the back of my mind is this kind of seemingly throwaway comment in the Talmud Bavli and Masechet Sotah, Babylonian Talmud, this really interesting observation, which on the surface seems like a ridiculous comment, but I think is actually quite profound. So here it is. This is what I called here the preface. Darash Rav Simlai taught, Torah, tchilatag milud chasadim, v'sofag milud chasadim. Torah, the beginning of Torah is loving kindness, and the end of Torah is loving kindness. And then he gives two examples. The beginning of Torah is loving kindness, that is God making clothes or skins or whatever we want to say for Adam and Eve. And then the end of Torah is God burying Moses in the valley. Now, obviously, Rabbi Simlai is not making some kind of idiotic observation here, which is that, oh, if you look at Genesis 3 and the end of Deuteronomy, you'll see two acts of loving kindness. When I say the beginning and end of X is Y, what I'm saying is that the very purpose of X, the reason X is in the world, is Y. Y is the very, if you'll pardon the pretentious word, the telos, the purpose, the end goal of what X is. Y is the reason that there is X in the world. And you can almost sort of, as it were, prove this point. There's a version of this in the Midrash on Kohelet, on Ecclesiastes, that says Torah tchilatag milul chasadim, emtzaitag milul chasadim, v'sofag milul chasadim. The beginning of Torah is loving kindness, the middle of Torah is loving kindness, and the end of Torah is loving kindness. Meaning, this is what it's all about and for. This is basically Judaism is about love. Torah is about love. By the way, I think that is probably also ultimately the deepest reason why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, which is at the time when we are receiving the Torah, we are given this little book that says, oh, if you want to know what it comes down to on some level, it's about the small moments of love and compassion in which we almost literally love each other back to life. That's the sort of reminder that it's all about chesed. And that's deliberately how I more or less end my book. Okay. Now, so I brought here, I'm not sure we'll get to all of that. Maybe we will, I'm not sure. I brought here 4 sources that really, I would say, kind of gave me no rest in the process of working on this book. And I want to begin with sharing a commentary on love your neighbor. So the mitzvah of loving your neighbor in Vayikra, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, one of the things about this that is so quintessentially and wonderfully Jewish is that everyone agrees that loving your neighbor is at the very heart of the Jewish tradition, and yet no one can agree about what it actually requires of us. Is there something so wonderful about that? Yes, it is klal gadol b'Torah. It is everything. What does it mean? Let's have an argument, right? So basically, people argue a lot about what love your neighbor means. And there's one thing that I studied that really kind of, I find that I carry it with me pretty much everywhere I go, partially because it's something that I feel I need to learn. Let's scroll down for a minute, if we could, to Ramban. And I guess in the interest of time, rather than reading this inside, I'm going to summarize it. I think that might be more effective, and then I hope people will take the time to read it more closely. But it requires some kind of translation from the way medieval Bible commentaries write to a more kind of spiritual, ethical language. Ramban basically is built on the fact that the Hebrew is arguably anomalous. The Torah does not say, V'ahavta et reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, but rather, V'ahavta lireacha kamocha, which perhaps hyper-literally can be read as, love for your neighbor as you love for yourself. For whatever it's worth, since this is, JTS and interested in the history of scholarship, Bible scholars are still very divided about whether ahava le and ahava et actually mean different things. But for Ramban, for Nachmanides, in the Middle Ages, they clearly did. And so he ends up suggesting that love your neighbor as yourself, love for your neighbor as you love for yourself, actually means something really profound. And he says essentially the following. Sometimes I go through life and I think, you know what? It's fine for you to have all the same blessings as I do, as long as I just have a little more of them. Or sometimes we even say, it's fine for you to have all the same blessings as I do, to the same extent that I do, except for the one thing I value most. That one I want to have a little more of. So you can be as rich as me and as good looking as me, but you're not as smart as me. Or you can be as smart as me and as good looking as me, but you can't be as successful as I am, etc., etc. And what Ramban says is, love your neighbor as yourself is an invitation to let go of this vice and to cultivate instead a posture of wanting other people to have all the same things I do, even to the same extent that I do. Now, why is this important? And why do I say that I've been carrying it with me ever since? It's because I think that a source like this represents a radical alternative to the culture in which we all too often find ourselves, in which we purchase the illusion of our own worth by comparing ourselves with others. We imagine that we're valuable through assuming that we're better than other people. And that is obviously an extremely toxic way to go through the world. And Ramban is inviting, if you scroll back up for 1 second, I titled this section, Love of Neighbor and Firgun. The word Firgun may be unfamiliar to some of you. This is a Yiddish word originally. To forgin is to be totally, I'm happy for you to have what you have. And then it becomes part of modern Hebrew slang, lefargen, right? And Ramban is essentially saying loving your neighbor is to adopt a posture of firgun. Oh, you just got an award and you and I are in the same field. I'm delighted for you. Oh, you just, had your whatever, fill in your blank here. That's wonderful. And I can't get over the idea that this represents such a critique of the way we perhaps inadvertently train kids to think. Let me give you just a very concrete example from my own experience. When I first read this Ramban, this is what popped into my mind, because I think it's actually something that many of us in our own experience can remember or relate to. My first job out of rabbinical school was as a Hillel rabbi at Harvard. And if I had $1 for every time a student came to me struggling with depression that sounded something like this, I'd be a rich person. Students would say to me something like, when I was in high school, I was the smartest person in the room. But here I'm just average. I'm not even sure I'm average. I might even be less than average. And I would find myself thinking, yeah, but why are you depressed about that? Then I would realize that most of these young adults did not have a sense of self-worth that was outside of competition. That's what high schools in America are. They're cauldrons of competition. And I didn't have this language in, but I found myself wondering, what would it be like to have a sense of self-worth that did not require being better than other people, did not require having more, did not require accomplishing more, simply operated on a different track than competition. And then years later, when I started playing around with this idea that I found in Jewish sources, that each of us is infinitely valuable simply because we're created in the image of God, not because of anything we do, just because of what we are, I found myself thinking, oh, can theology be an alternative to this culture of destructive competition? Can we build a world in which I say, oh, I'm already infinitely valuable just simply because I'm human. And by the way, the reason that I'm infinitely valuable is the reason why you're infinitely valuable too. There's no competition here. There's never a zero-sum game between my image of God and your image of God. We both are that. We both are that. Now, this, I guess what I sort of want to say about this is that on one level, what I'm saying sounds totally obvious. And on another level, it is so hard. It represents a repudiation and a counterculture to something that just runs so deep in our culture. And just to sort of accentuate this for 1 second, I think that what so frequently happens when it comes to the illusion of self-worth that comes from competition is that kind of race for the illusion of self-worth is doubly toxic. First of all, it only ever gets us fool's gold, because anyone whose self-worth is based on the idea that they're better looking than someone else is then going to meet someone that they worry is better looking than they are. And then all of a sudden they're back to sort of square one again. Or you find this a lot in academic settings. Anyone whose self-worth is based on thinking they're smarter than other people then meets someone else they worry might be smarter than they. And then, they start to eat each other for breakfast. Or at the other extreme, which is really actually kind of the same point in a different way, this is the ultimate prescription for spending our life in schadenfreude, right? In just needing other people to fail. I rise as you fall. That's not a prescription for being in a very loving posture towards other people. So I found these words in Ramban so simple and yet so totally piercing of a certain way that we've structured our society, that I find myself wondering a lot these days, and I'm not sure how far I've gotten in thinking about this, what it would really mean to build Jewish schools, for example, whether day schools or, supplemental schools or whatever, in which we actually offered people a truly Jewish theological conception of self-worth that would enable firgun, and that would enable thereby the fulfillment of the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself, or again, loving for your neighbor as you love for yourself. Let me stop for a minute. Julia, are there any questions yet that are worth should stop us for a few minutes?
I think we could stop now.
Okay, great. Let's do that.
So I'll start with the narrowest. Can you just define firgun? Because you used it in a lot of ways, but just
that's actually, it's a good. So I would translate firgun as being fine with and even happy about other people having things. Mm. Not threatened by your success. I'm not threatened by your wealth. I'm not threatened by your good looks. I'm not threatened by, it's fine. It's totally fine. That's how it's certain. I would almost translate firgun as a certain kind of generosity of spirit.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I wanted to start with a question of my own, actually, and then I'll come back to one more from participants. Please. I'm just thinking a lot about what you laid out in the beginning, kind of the need for a book that claims and clearly establishes that Judaism is about love. So you talked about the rabbinical student, and you talked about the Christian students that you spoke with, and you made me think of an experience that I had when I was doing clinical pastoral education in a largely Christian setting. For the course of the summer, each of the trainees in this program needed to lead an interfaith service. So, my week came up and I gave a little homily, as they called it, Hadar Torah, as I called it, as part of my service. And I spoke about Parshat Shavua, the weekly Torah portion, and it was the summer. So it was Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. And they were like totally blown away by this, all the Christians, they really liked my Hadar Torah, and they said, it never would have occurred to me to speak about numbers, like ever. I never look at numbers. We spend, a fifth of the year looking at numbers. And so my question is this, those students who you asked, where is Jesus getting that religion and life, or sort of living the good and right life is about love. Are we in this position of needing to establish that Judaism is about love because have we kind of ceded to Christianity, love is embodied physically, metaphorically and physically by Jesus, and if it's not Jesus, then it's not love. We don't need to look to earlier sources. Is that sort of part of the genesis of this problem? And then is the next piece of it that we've just sort of gone along with that and bought into that? I guess this is more a historic, sort of like a philosophical, historical question than anything else. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like you're actually saying a few different things. So I'm going to try to, if I could, I'm going to try to just sort of seize on to where you ended. So I actually think that if we want to tell a complicated story here, there's 3 dimensions to this. One is the one that I already mentioned, which obviously I emphasized about how Christians told a story about Judaism. And I would just add as a footnote to that, we know that minority cultures all too often come to view themselves through the eyes of the majority culture. It is not actually surprising that Jews came to think about Judaism the way Christianity taught Jews to think about Judaism. Despite how much you would think there would be rebelliousness and resistance to it, I think what all too often happens is quite the opposite. So that's piece number one. But I think there's another dimension here, which is that although no one has ever really fully studied this, sometime in the course of American Jewish history, probably in the wake of World War II, but again, I can't prove this, many American Jews who did not have a deep understanding of Judaism, but who had a lot of anxiety about assimilation, began to define their own Judaism as whatever they imagined Christianity was not. And we see many versions of this. The most probably famous example of this is that very bizarre thing that was kind of a truism in American Jewish education for a long time. Judaism has no notion of the afterlife. I mean, that's just a bizarre claim to make if you know anything about the history of Jewish thought. It's not true, right? And I think where it came from is that American Jews who did not have a particularly rich understanding of Christianity, but they did have a kind of popular understanding of Christianity, were taught, oh, Christianity is all about the world to come. It's not a good reading about Christianity, by the way, but okay, Christianity is all about the world to come. Therefore, we Jews, we don't even talk about it. We don't have that. And similarly, Jews were like, well, Christianity is all about love. We must be about justice, law, whatever. Now, if you think about this, this is kind of a double whammy, right? On the one hand, you have the majority culture telling you that you're loveless. And on the other hand, you're anxious not to be the majority culture. So you're saying, okay, we are loveless. We're something else. That's a very toxic brew. When you have that combination, you're basically seeding very quickly the heart in both senses of that word, heart as in the, the heart of the human being, and heart as in the core of the Jewish tradition. There's a third piece to it, which is even, I think, complicates the picture even more, which is that, because Jews have always been suspicious of purely emotional religion that doesn't manifest concretely in the world, so we've often focused on, okay, but how do you express that concretely? I think that has sometimes been taken to excess. We already have Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda in the Middle Ages basically saying, I don't really like how a lot of rabbis talk about chovot ha'evarim, the mitzvot of the body, and they don't talk about chovot halvavot, the mitzvot of the heart. And I think that that's an internal Jewish dynamic, not because Judaism isn't about love, but because Judaism is suspicious about love as an abstraction. Just to sort of maybe give a very concrete example of this that I think a lot of people can relate to. If you've ever met someone who tells you how they're all about compassion, but you've never seen them do anything for anyone, you know that there's a certain kind of fraudulence that can come from a purely trusting people about what they say they feel. So it's a healthy impulse in Judaism to be suspicious of that, but that healthy impulse sometimes gets taken to extremes. That long predates Christianity, right? I mean, Heschel is already complaining, not that he's so early, obviously, but Heschel complains about how, you have certain Jewish thinkers who talk about halakha as if it's everything, and agadah, the life of the spirit, becomes totally secondary. Now, when you add all three of those factors together, that's a lot. That's really a lot. That makes the climb rather intense and uphill. And that's the climb I think the Jewish community has to undertake, or else we live with a distorted or truncated understanding of our own Torah.
Thank you. Do you want to take one more?
Sure.
So the question is about, I think the marriage analogy that you offered was helpful to a lot of people. And one person asked, could you see faith the same way that, speaking of Heschel, seems to me like Heschel would like this direction. You can't feel faith at every moment, but but like leading a religious life is about a commitment to faith and disposition to faith, returning to faith, aiming towards faith. Do you think that's an apt parallel in terms of how you're seeing love?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, I think in the sense here, the language of commitment is really important, which is like the same way that love involves a commitment to act in certain ways, even when I'm not feeling it. Faith or religious commitment, right, involves a commitment to a certain kind of spiritual discipline, even when I'm not feeling it. Some would argue, especially when I'm not feeling it. And there's a reason, maybe that's reason number 762, why religious people often think about their relationship with God along the metaphor of marriage, precisely because it's not intense feeling all the time, right? I mean, no one walks around feeling madly in love with God all the time, certainly not in our like massively disenchanted world. But they still might have a posture of love of God or faith in God. So yeah, I like that connection a lot, actually. Should I go on, Julia, or is there more that you wanted to?
I'm intrigued by one that just came in, but I think I need to actually process it a little more. So I'm going to hold it and let's continue with your sources.
Okay, great. Let's do that. So let's look at sort of unit 2 for a minute. This is the top of page 3, Tani, if you can get it. Perfect. So love of the ger. I wanted to just share a couple of observations about this that are a good example of, I always like to say, you know, if you come to know something so well, let me put it differently. Sometimes we feel we know something so well that we can no longer hear what claim it's making on us. So sort of everybody knows the Torah says, don't oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay, right? But it's really worth thinking about what the Torah is doing here and the steps it takes in getting there. So kind of, I'm going to take a little walk through these sources for a minute. So we start in the book of Exodus in Shemot, and we see this kind of process begin. Shemot says, this is one of 2 prohibitions on oppressing the stranger in Shemot. V'ger lo tilchatz. I'm going to explain what the word ger means in 1 second. You shall not oppress a stranger. V'atem yedatem et nefesh hager, because you know the experience of the stranger. Ki gerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So a ger, biblically speaking, translated in the JPS as a stranger. Some older translations use sojourner or even alien. A ger is someone who is not part of the kin group and therefore not part of the in group and therefore vulnerable to exploitation. And the Torah here says you shall not oppress the ger because you know what it feels like. You remember what it was like to be a stranger in the land of Egypt. Now, just to sort of underscore something that I think is often mistaught or misapprehended, the Torah is not suggesting that the prohibition on oppressing the stranger derives from our experience about being strangers in Egypt, because that makes no sense. Then Pharaoh could say, well, I was never a stranger in Egypt, therefore I can do whatever I want. No, the prohibition on oppressing a stranger comes from the prohibition on taking advantage of the powerless and the vulnerable. But as Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, one of the great later medieval commentators on the Torah, says, this is about intensification of an always already present moral obligation, right? This is what makes Jews, or ought to make us especially sensitive to not oppressing the stranger, because we ourselves have had this experience. It doesn't derive from there, but a certain moral passion about it comes from there. Now, one step further, we get to Vayikra, and what was until now a prohibition, you shall not oppress the stranger, becomes something else. It becomes a positive obligation, a mitzvat aseh. So looking at Vayikra, v'chi yagur itcha ger ba'artzechem lo tonu oto. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress them. Ka'ezrach mikem yelachem hager hagar itchem. The stranger who resides with you shall be as one of your native born. Here, by the way, full disclosure, I edited the JPS. JPS translates ezrach as citizen. I do not think that is right in biblical Hebrew. I think it doesn't mean that. Citizen is a political term, whereas ezrach, I think, means actually something that is like organic, a native to the soil, if you will, right? So you should treat them as if they were an ezrach, ve'ahavta lo kamocha, and you should love him as yourself. We saw in Vayikra 14 verses earlier, love your neighbor as yourself. Here we're taught, love the stranger as yourself as well. Kigerim hiyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So what in Shmot had been a negative commandment, do not oppress, in Vayikra goes from being also a negative commandment to a positive commandment. You should actively love the stranger. Now, this is where it seems to me it's important to stop, slow down, and hear these verses as if for the first time. There is nothing obvious about this. You can imagine a world in which people said, I was a stranger, no one did anything to protect me, therefore, I'm not worried about anyone but myself. And you could imagine a world in which people say, I was a stranger, no one protected me, therefore, I feel like everyone who's unprotected is my responsibility. And what I think is so important to see is that the Torah is making a choice here and inviting us to make the same choice. Yes, you could learn from the past to be totally morally indifferent to everyone who's vulnerable, but choose the opposite. And the argument that I develop in the book, for whatever it's worth, is that I think most people, forget now about the Jewish people as a whole, I mean, just for a moment, I think most people who have been through experiences of vulnerability or oppression actually recognize both of these voices. The voice that says, you know, if you had been in that marriage, you would know that I don't owe anybody anything. And the voice that says, oh my God, I was in that marriage. I feel like every spouse who's vulnerable is my responsibility. And the Torah is actually asking us, inviting us to nurture one of those voices rather than the other. This is so important because I think people tend to talk very, very naively about memory. Right? As if, oh, if you just remember things, they will lead you to ethical sensitivity. You know, there was a moment here, I'm, dating myself, but in the 1990s, during the Bosnian genocide, in which, if you may remember, the two sides were relitigating a battle from 500 years before. Even Elie Wiesel, the American Society's great apostle of memory, basically gives a speech and he says, I may have been a little naive when I kept saying, remember, remember, remember. It's a certain kind of remember that I'm advocating for. Remember, it can be toxic. There's a Christian theologian whose work I really, really admire named Miroslav Volf. And he has this formula, and Miroslav Volf, as you can hear from his name, is Croatian, so remembers that period well. Miroslav Volf actually describes memory as, I love this phrase, dangerously underdetermined. Dangerously underdetermined, or to put it in a very crude and provocative way, the Holocaust has no moral meaning before we assign it one. Or to use my own language for a minute, we shape the memory that in turn shapes us. We shape the memory that in turn shapes us. And so I think it's very important that we become more conscious of what the Torah is actually trying to do here. And then if we just take one step further, when we get to Dvarim, we'll see this really subtle. We saw this amping up from Shmot to Vayikra, from Exodus to Leviticus, and now we're going to see this really subtle amping up from Leviticus to Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy 10, Ki Adonai Elohechem hu Elohei Elohim va'Adonai Adonim, for the Lord your God is the God of all gods and the Lord of all lords. Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanorah, words that are familiar to you most likely from the prayer, from the Amidah prayer, the great, the mighty, the awesome God. And then this wonderfully subversive, what makes God awesome? Asher lo yisafanim b'lo yikach shochat, the fact that God does not show favorites or take bribes, but rather, osem mishpat yatom v'almana, God champions the cause of the orphan and the widow. And then here come the words that matter most for us. Ve'ohev ger latet lo lechem v'simla, and God loves the stranger and expresses that love by giving the stranger food and clothing. And then the mitzvah, v'aftem et hager, and you too must love the stranger, ki gerim hiyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, on the surface, This is verse 19 is repeating Vayikra, love the stranger because you're strangers. But actually, if you read this as a unit, you see something astonishing has been argued here, which is love of the stranger has now been elevated to a form of imitating God. God loves the stranger. Therefore, if you claim to be a people who loves God, you have to love the stranger too, because to love God is to come to love those whom God loves. And so love of stranger is this incredibly elevated notion where I become godly precisely in loving the stranger. This is kind of the sort of, you might even say, the conclusion or the climax of this vision that Shemot develops. This vision that the Chumash develops of love as really fundamentally the project, if you will, the project that we learn from our suffering. And this is part of a larger commitment. I think it is not crazy to think about the law codes in the Torah as about trying to create a society that is consciously a radical alternative to Egypt. It is kind of creating almost like a counter society, if you will. Oh, Egypt trods all over the stranger. We love the stranger. Egypt, to take another example from Dvarim, right? Egypt takes advantage of slaves. We harbor runaway slaves and don't return them to their master, and on and on and on and on. And there's something really, really fundamental here. And what I sort of want to also just propose, building on the Hasidic idea of taking the Exodus and personalizing it, that here we also have to take this as a personal mandate. You know the feelings of the stranger. Each of us takes our own experience of estrangement and vulnerability, and ideally tries to take those as opportunities to grow in love. Not in some Pollyannish way, not by denying that the pain is real, but really on the contrary, by being fully open to the pain and the suffering that we've endured, to thereby become more open to the suffering of others as well. Biblically speaking, we could even call this a double act of moral imagination. First, I have to imagine that I myself came out from Egypt, famous, right? Fundamental experience of the Seder. B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo. In every generation, person has to see herself as if she were a slave. That's moral imagination number one. And then moral imagination number two, part two, is, oh, there are people in parallel situations right now. How do I learn to care for them? There's a wonderful line, Rabbi Eliyahu Lopian, who was a great Musar teacher in the 20th century, in the Musar movement, he says in Shmot, "Va'atemi datem nefesh hager," you know the feelings of the stranger, is usually understood to be a descriptive, but maybe it's also a mandate. You have to know your own feelings of estrangement, because what you don't know about your own suffering will in fact hurt other people. What you don't know does hurt other people. So there's a way in which, one of the things I personally find so moving about this mitzvah is that I can make it intensely personal. It's about me and my personal relationships. And the Torah invites me to also make it intensely communal and national. Given our experience as slaves in the land of Egypt, given our experience as strangers, what do we choose to learn from our past? Julia, do we want to stop again? Are there any?
Yeah, we do have questions. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask you two together, and I'll just read them verbatim. One person said, "Are we differentiating between the Jewish stranger and the non-Jewish stranger?" And then immediately after that, someone else said, "Great stuff, but how do you love your oppressors? Are we supposed to love Hamas?"
Okay, so sorry, can you just give me the first question? I want to try to disentangle those.
Yeah, they're different questions. Sorry, I should have.
Yeah. No, I'm just bad at holding questions because I get caught up in one. So give me them again, please. Sorry.
So the first is, are we differentiating between the Jewish stranger and the non-Jewish stranger?
So, it's actually interesting. I don't know whether the questioner, whether this was part of what you had in mind, but there's actually an interesting academic debate about whether the term ger was always used for non-Israelites who were living among the Israelites, or whether ger could also refer to Israelites who had been displaced from their tribe and were now living in a different Israelite tribe. I don't know if that was any way in the background of this question, but it's actually an interesting historical question as well. I think that when you think about, look, there's no one-to-one correspondence, I think, between a biblical ger and some particular category of contemporary immigrant. So when you think instead about an ethos that we can derive from this text, it's clearly the case, I think, that anytime someone is living amongst us without access to the levers of power, they become people we have to look after, whether they are ethnically or religiously our own, or whether they're not. I mean, I do think that one of the radical moves here is love your neighbor in Vayikra clearly refers to fellow Jews. I think there's no other way to understand the pshat of those verses, right? And then when 14 verses later, we hear about loving the stranger, we are clearly at least considering pushing the boundaries of love beyond the covenant towards those who are partial outsiders. But that doesn't mean that there can't be partial outsiders who are also technically insiders. I hope that that's clear. Can you nod if we followed what I just said? I'm not sure I said that very clearly. I hope that was at least somewhat clear. Julia, you'll tell me if you think that was not a helpful formulation.
I thought it was sufficiently clear.
Okay, great, perfect. Thank you. So that's an important category, and it's of course also potentially in the background of some of this is that, of course, as you know, the word ger will then evolve in its meaning and eventually come to mean convert. I suspect, by the way that happened, at least in part, well, two things. This is going to I hope I don't make anyone dizzy here. Two things happen. One is that when Jews no longer have a polity, no longer have like a political control over anything, the way the word ger doesn't fall into total obsolescence and irrelevance is that it becomes, oh, well, what is the parallel to an outsider who's vulnerable to the power of the collective? Well, that's someone who might be converting to Judaism and trying to find their way in. What enabled that, and this maybe bridges to the second question, and I actually think I should have said more about this in my book. I didn't, because my primary concern in the chapter about the ger was about the powerful's obligation towards the ger. But I think the Bible also thinks that the ger has certain obligations towards those in power, which is partially becoming part of the community. There's certain rituals, for example, that the ger has to partake in. That's why I translated ger in passing earlier as partial outsider rather than outsider. Whatever category Hamas falls into, I do not think it is coherent to talk about Hamas as gerim. I think to the extent that you want to talk about whatever obligations one has to Hamas, you could talk about the question about whether there is an obligation to love enemies and what that means. I don't think that people who are sworn to your destruction, let me underscore 57,000 times. I am talking here about members of Hamas, not Palestinians, but people who are sworn to your destruction do not qualify as gerim and do not qualify for those protections. I don't think that makes sense. There's another discussion to be had. That's not the end of the discussion. That's the beginning of the discussion. That next discussion is what obligations might we have towards people who wish us ill. But I think that's a different category than this.
Thank you.
Is there another one from this category, or are those the two that were in this?
There's another from before that I thought was worth asking, but I can also save it to the end.
Up to you. Whatever you think makes sense is good with me.
Why don't you continue and I'll save it to the end since it's not on this piece.
Okay, great. So I want to share with you something else. This is a passage that, unlike the ones that kind of bothered and unsettled me, this I found really very moving. This is source 3, which I think you just might have accidentally scrolled through, Tani, or whoever is doing the scrolling. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So, I think that a lot of people who are exposed to kind of contemporary spirituality, and especially neo-Hasidic spirituality, have been exposed to the idea that dveikut, or cleaving to God, is achieved in moments of prayer, and specifically ecstatic prayer. And I found it really interesting, and I wanted to write about this in the book, and because I wanted to bring this to people just as a kind of a different way of thinking about this, is how some Mussar writers, in contrast to Hasidim, tend to talk about dveikut. Dveikut is, if you know modern Hebrew, the word devek, meaning glue, right? How do you attach yourself to God, if you will? And this is from Rabbi Yecheskel Levenstein, who was one of the great leaders of the Mir Yeshiva in Belarus, and then, if this means anything to you, when the Mir Yeshiva was in exile in Shanghai, and then in Jerusalem, and the Mir Yeshiva, one of the the central Haredi yeshivas in modern times. He says this paragraph that I couldn't shake thinking about this paragraph. I still think about this all the time, to be honest. Here's what he says. He's going to start out quoting the Mesilat Yesharim, one of the great kind of classic Jewish spiritual guidance texts. Ki ha'adam lo nivra ela li'taneg hal Hashem v'le'anot miziv shchinato. A person is only created to delight in God and to bask in the light of God's presence. And then, summarizing what he's just quoted, he says, Kol tachlit ha'adam. He just wants to underscore the very purpose of a person, rak kidei lehanot miziv hashchina. The very purpose of a person is to delight in the light of the divine presence. Now, again, if you're reading Hasidic text, you're now going to hear about the Amida and this, the loss of the self in the experience of God. But here, you're going to find something totally different than that. Omnam, he says, says, I really want to be clear. Delighting in the presence of God, that is not just what happens after we die. The righteous merit delighting in the presence of God even in this world. How do they do that? When do they do that? He says, when the righteous achieve or are blessed with or merit, it's hard to translate zochim, it's a really elusive word. When they merit the fullness of the attribute of loving kindness, which is one of God's own attributes, then they are effectively, kind of a little bit translating a little freely here, they are effectively delighting in the light of the divine presence in this world. When I am truly compassionate, not I, because I am not among the tzaddikim, but when one, right, when one achieves moments of true compassion, that is dveikut, because in some sense, I think maybe we can even say, I am cleaving to and maybe even participating in the divine compassion. So, speaking very personally for a minute, maybe too personally, I sometimes get the willies listening to some people talk about dveikut in neo-Hasidic ways, because it sometimes feels to me like, oh, it's all about my own ecstatic experience. And what implications that has for the person I'm about to run into on the street? Well, I don't know. I'm having an ecstatic experience. I want to be clear. That's actually on some level totally unfair, because Hasidic masters will say, of course it has an impact on how you interact with others. But I get nervous about the excess of privileging religious experience. I'm not against it. I'm just nervous about it. And that's why when I started encountering this kind of trope or motif in Mussar texts, I found it very, very moving, because what it's saying is that not only does dveikut always lead to the ethical, dveikut actually takes place in the ethical, right? The way to be cleaved to God cleaved. The way to be cleaved to God is actually in the moment of truly caring about another person. I participate in something godly in that moment. I wish I had more to say about this. I just find this really challenging, inspiring, daunting, frankly. It makes me wonder if I've ever actually experienced dveikut or how rare it is. Because I don't think this is just talking about, oh yeah, a person was suffering and I had compassion. I think it's really talking about when I become totally focused on the needs of the other person. Not with some narrator in my head who's talking to me about how compassionate I am, right? But actually really just focusing on the needs of the person in front of me. I find this to be just really worth meditating on, reflecting on, thinking about our work. Many of you on this call are rabbis, thinking about what it means to be sitting with congregants who are hurting and having this in mind. I just think there's a lot here that I'm not yet really able to be fully articulate about. And I think that there's it's just really worth sitting with this. That's the best I can do right now. And sort of opening up this as a kind of refusal of the ever-present temptation to divorce religion entirely from the interpersonal sphere by a kind of almost counterweight that makes the opposite claim in an extreme way, which is that, no, the height of the religious life is precisely and maybe even exclusively, I don't know, in the interpersonal sphere. So I wanted to sort of just kind of lay that out for you to sort of just sit with a little bit. Julia, are there more questions about that little piece I just did, or should I just keep going and do one more piece?
Give me 1 sec to answer that question.
No worries, not at all.
I think there was a question directly on this, which I think was kind of, I think sort of giving voice to the Willies image that you gave, or the one who you react to in that way, which I related to, and maybe even if one is really in a state of such religious ecstasy, can you even have awareness of, have you lost the interpersonal piece? And like, am I being a compassionate person? Is there almost like a zero-sum thing going on, or can you kind of, at least in theory, could one sort of be in your state of ecstasy and then and somehow carry that over into the interpersonal?
When you ask that question, I'm reminded of a text that I think I saw like 30 years ago. And it was so long ago that it's possible that I'm making this up, which is why I'm very hesitant to share it. But I think that there is a passage in the Noam Elimelech of Lizhensk, one of the circle of Hasidic masters around the Maggid of Mezrich. So this is back into sort of the world of dveikut as ecstatic prayer. If I remember correctly, he has this amazing discussion. Elimelech of Lizhensk was very focused on the tzaddik, the tzaddik in the Hasidic sense, right? The Hasidic master. And he says something like, the master feels very frustrated at first when the Hasidim come with what the Hasidim come with. And they come with, in Hasidut, this is very commonly referred to as chaye banei umizone, people who need sustenance, children, and food. He says, and the master is just really ambivalent about, he wants to be in his study, davening, having dveikut with God, and people want to come to him for a bracha for children. And then he says, and then the tzaddik eventually has a moment when he realizes that the chaye banei umizone of his chasidim are a moment of dveikut for him. That's kind of what I think this question is groping for. Is there a moment like that? And I think there can be. I just, again, get the willies, and I'm not sure there always is. But, look, this goes to some deeper and fundamental point. I don't know whether any spiritual practice guarantees ethical sensitivity, because any spiritual practice can basically be formed into a form of narcissism, right? Anything. Meditation can make you grow in presence and compassion. It can also make you be totally out to lunch, right? Davening can awaken you. It can also make you clueless. So it's such a hard and important question. And maybe the challenge is always, no matter what we feel most drawn to ask, do other people experience me as more loving as a result of this practice? That is not an unimportant question, I think, to orient us in the religious life. Are other people better off because I daven? I think that's a really important and interesting question to think about. Or if you prefer, are other people worse off because I don't daven? I mean, you can find different versions of this, but okay.
It's sort of, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No,
Go
it's
ahead.
kind of, I love that story that you shared. And I think it's sort of taking it from the other direction. Like the starting point is helping people with their needs, and is my this Rebbe asking himself, is my religiosity taking that into account? Is that the orientation of my religiosity? I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. Okay. So let me end with this is a kind of a grandiose way to begin this last piece, but I want to say that of all the texts that I learned, and if you look at the footnotes of this book, you'll know that I went through an experience of almost manically learning a lot of Torah to write this book. And of all the texts that I learned, this is the one that I found most just profoundly and deeply unsettling. And if I had more time, I would talk about how, in general, it's really interesting that a lot of the things Christians tend to talk about when they talk about love of enemies are also pretty pervasive in Chazal, in rabbinic literature. And I write about that at some length. I don't think Judaism and Christianity are equivalent on this issue, but I do think a lot of things Christians tend to talk about. I mean, just an example I've literally done this with like Jews who daven 3 times a day, and they're totally surprised. But like Christians are obsessed with the idea, Christians who write about love of enemies, about the ethos of non-retaliation. So I'll say to Jews who daven regularly, you daven 3 times a day for the ethos of non-retaliation. People are like, what? Where? What? And say, in the end of the Amidah, you say, "V'lemakalelai nafshi tidom." To those who curse me, may my soul remain silent. May I learn not to respond. Or the rabbis celebrate those who manage to be insulted without feeling the need to insult in return. There's a lot of examples of this that make this conversation really rich and interesting. There's one text that, as I say, gave me no rest, because at times I found it moving, at times I found it offensive, at times I found it naive, and I really wrestled with it. And after we learn it, I'll tell you a story, an experience I had teaching this text right after I first discovered it. So Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, says, Im ra'ev sonacha hachileu lechem, v'im tzameh hashkeu mayim. If your neighbor is, if someone who hates you, if your enemy is hungry, feed him food. And if thirsty, give him water to drink. And then a verse that no one can explain. You see this if you look at medieval commentators or at modern scholars. They are all over the map about what this metaphor means, because you will be pouring hot coals upon his head, and God will repay you, something like that, reward you. What the hot coals are, I want to leave that. And I want to share with you this line in Midrash Mishlei that I came across, which intensifies the verse in Mishlei in such an interesting way. Here's what it says. That's a quoting of the verse, okay? There's Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, Afal pi shehishkim lahorgecha, uva ra'ev od tzamei letoch beitcha, hachileu vehashkehu. Even though the person came to your home with the intention of killing you, if he showed up hungry or thirsty, give him food or drink. Lama, right? You are pouring hot coals on his head, again, whatever that means. And then, al tikre yishalem lach ela yashlimenu lach. God will reconcile the two of you. Now, I should say, There are other versions of this text. I'm pretty convinced this is the correct version, the way I just read it, but I want to acknowledge not every version reads this way. Just the conclusion. The instruction is universal, is in every version. But just what al tikra yishalem lach ela what yashlimenu lach. Okay, be that as it may. So I find myself thinking, well, this is really sort of bizarre. And the language hishkim lahorgecha is, I think, meant to provoke in you, right? This rabbinic idea that if someone comes to kill you, hashkem lahorgo, you kill them first. But here's a midrash that says, oh, if someone comes to kill you, but they're hungry, feed them, and God will reconcile you. Now, so I want to just make an observation about this, that a midrash can allow itself to say something that a halachic text, a legal text, will not. You will never find a halachic text that says, if someone comes to kill you and they're hungry, give them a sandwich. Because that might be reckless and irresponsible and might get you killed. But a midrash can allow itself to just provoke you and then walk away. Kind of what midrash does, right? Midrash says, think about it like this. You say, wait a minute. If someone comes to hurt you and you have no alternative, you kill them first. And then the midrash says, okay, but is this one of those times? And so here's what happened to me when I read this text. I was so taken aback by it. It's interesting how some Jews, when you present them certain texts that say radical things, they'll be like, that sounds like Christianity to me, right? This goes back to where we started. So I read this text and I was like, here's a text that I'm undoubtedly, some Jews are going to hear this and say, well, that sounds like Christianity. Well, okay, maybe. So I handed this text to a room full of rabbis. And I said, okay, help me with this. And here's what happened. This is my best recollection of what happened. One person raised their hand and said, this reminds me of stories of like rabbis or cantors who invite white supremacists to their house for Shabbos dinner and essentially kind of convert them out of their white supremacy. And then another rabbi raised their hand and said, I've been stalked by white supremacists. I can't live with this text. And then they started sobbing in front of this room. It was very, very moving. Like I sort of feel like that's Talmud Torah at its best, in that like people just brought the most raw experiences of their life and put it out there. I don't know what to make of this text, other than that it maybe is asking us, not in the moment, although maybe, but it's asking us to sort of think about, is every situation where we think of violence, interpersonal violence, as the only alternative, really a case where that's the case? That was not a good English sentence, but I hope it was clear what I just meant, right? Is every time that we think I have no alternative but to act violently here in the interpersonal sphere, is every case like that? Am I right every time I think it? Is that what this midrash wants to ask? But it also led me to something that some people will undoubtedly argue is a cop-out, and maybe on some level it is, but it feels really true to me for whatever it's worth, that this is a good example, I think, of how religion is sometimes better at giving us better language for questions than it is at giving us definitive answers. There's no guidebook or playbook here. There's just the question of, might there be some situations where we think there's no room for a humane response, where maybe there is room for one? Are there situations like that? And I love this text because it upsets me so much, right? I love this text because it bothers me so much. And it makes me want to start yelling, wait a minute, this is irresponsible. And I think texts, if I'm true to my own sort of philosophy of learning, that one of the things learning Torah is supposed to do is unsettle us, this text unsettled me more than any I learned, which is why I wanted to bring it to you. Not because I have anything so clear and prescriptive to say about it, but just because I think it's worth hearing the sheer multiplicity of voices that find their way into this vast ocean we call Torah. And maybe I'll stop there. And Julia, if there are questions, I'm happy to take them. Questions about this, or for that matter, about anything else, and about whether and how these pieces tie together.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you.
okay, so one person wrote, maybe the coals mean you will shock them to recognize you as a human being, not the enemy. And then 3 different people shared the story of this older woman who on October 7th shared cookies or food or something with Hamas terrorists in her home and was then spared. Let's just repeat what you said. This is not a halachic prescription to do this, but
Right.
the story brought that up for a lot of people. I wonder what thoughts you have.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about invoking that story is that it sort of like feels like, how can you not? And yet that story is different, because I suspect that most people who invoke it, maybe I'm wrong, if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be corrected on this, are invoking it as, well, giving food there, it may be a survival strategy. Whereas I think this text might be trying to say something else, which is that giving people food is a conversion strategy, meaning conversion in the sense of changing your neighbor's heart. That goes back to the first comment you meant, that maybe that's what the coal on their head is. You know, this is sort of funny, but there's one medieval commentary, not funny, but who says, what is the pouring coal on their head? It's actually saying to someone, I know you want to hurt me, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity to improve my character rather than worsen it. I love that. I mean, I'm not sure that I know what to do with it concretely, but it's really interesting. So I may be wrong about that, but the Hamas story feels to me to be like, it's the obvious association that you can't not make now. And yet it does feel a little different than what this text is talking about. I don't know. I haven't seen, like, was that woman's intention to bring those guys to a conversion of the heart whereby they forswore their desire to do violence? Or was it to sort of like keep them from killing her until help came? It feels like it was probably the latter, but maybe I'm wrong.
So another really interesting comment that just came in about this text. The person is talking about firearms, which didn't exist then, but I'm thinking about, I'm kind of broadening the question to think that like I suppose there were arrows, but let's think for a moment about the idea that in ancient times you had to get physically closer to your enemy to hurt or kill them.
Yeah.
So there's something that sort of, you could imagine giving bread, or like you're close enough to dump the coals. I'm just thinking about also like social media now. Like there's so many ways to hurt people from afar that allows us to not see them as human beings.
I think that that's actually an incredibly profound comment, and it's one that I've thought about in the context of this text also, which is a lot of the times when someone wants to kill you in this day and age, they're standing, hundreds of yards away, or maybe even, at a computer, tens of thousand miles away if we're talking about military stuff. And this is sort of presumes a certain face-to-faceness. I mean, literally, what does the term hand-to-hand combat mean, right? I think that that's actually really powerful. And your association with it, Julia, also for me is very resonant, meaning, at the risk of saying something cliche, it is amazing how much interacting on social media simply allows us to forget that there's a human being on the other end of the conversation. When I think about the things people have said to me on social media over the years, just like, I'm amazed that any human being would say that to anybody, right? And like, what allows you to do that? And I guess maybe the next question, though, is, in a world where we're not always facing the enemy who's attacking us face to face, what, if anything, can we still learn from this text, which is about face-to-face encounter, right? Like, rather than saying, well, our world is different, which it is, or rather than only saying that, so I think that's what I'm trying to say, what might I still learn? What might I learn about interacting with someone who is attacking me on social media? Like an example of this, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, and if you think I'm talking about politics now, please assume that I'm not. I don't know if any of you have ever witnessed Cory Booker interacting with people on Facebook who attack him. it's actually exceptionally moving. People will say things to Cory Booker like they'll call him N-word, they'll like say the most degradingly racist things, and he'll respond by saying, and you're a person created in the image of God and you're capable of great love. And every time I see it, it almost reduces me to tears. I don't even know if it's him. It could be some guy in his office he's told to do this. But it's so interesting, right? It's like, I refuse to fire back, right? That's that ethos of non-retaliation again. It's not, oh, you call me a racist, you're a Neanderthal. It's like, no, this is not your best self. I know that. I don't know. It's such a, I love that question so much. I wish I had more insight into it, but it feels really right. This is sort of about, oh, the person who's coming to kill you, they can still see your face. Maybe there's some way in which that can represent a breakthrough. And then we are stuck with the question, what about those many situations where that's simply not the case?
I think it comes back to the generosity of spirit that you were talking about as one core definition of love. I mean, that's right. That's what's in that Cory Booker response. I'm gonna choose to believe that this isn't your best self, right? He may or may not have a reason to believe that, but he's decided.
Yeah, by the way, I think what Cory Booker is doing there, whether or not this is how he thinks about it, I have no idea, but is thinking about what the philosophies of nonviolence have often argued, which is that when you respond nonviolently, you confront the other person subtly with their own behavior, right? Instead of like hitting them back, you say, oh, really? That's who you are? You don't have to be that, right? There's just something very, very inspiring about that.
Yeah.
Okay, I wish I had like a great closing word. I don't think I do.
Well, so can I give you a closing question? There were a few more great questions that I really wanted to get to. So we're only going to have time for one, but I'm going to ask you one that hopefully will give you an entree for your closing word.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So, so one person was kind of observing that a lot of the focus, especially in the text modeling, in the text in which God models chesed and for us, clothing the naked, burying the dead, etc., that there's a focus on physical needs. And the person was interested to hear if you could speak about an expression of God's love for the individual that's more oriented towards their kind of emotional well-being than their physical needs.
Well, it's interesting because the two cases that we started with about, burying the dead and clothing the naked and burying the dead, the two other examples that usually fit on that list are visiting the sick and comforting the mourners. And I will say that I do think, according to halachic text, the first mitzvah of visiting the sick is concrete, like, what can I do for you? But it's obviously not limited to that. And comforting mourners, right, is so much about presence. The idea that God, as it were, pays a shiva call is just such a moving idea. And that's really not about, I mean, of course, it can be about physical needs. Have you eaten today? But it's so much more than that. And I think you really do see that. There's a whole array of rabbinic texts about a God who just says, like, oh, you're suffering, I'll suffer with you. The notion of keeping company for those who are experiencing misery or unhappiness, it just seems like there's like an awful lot there to play with. Again, Nichum Avelim, comforting the mourners, is a really good example of this, but I don't think it's limited to that. Maybe I'll end with an image that is very important to me in my own life and that I talk about in this book, even though it is tied to physical things as well, concrete needs. But one of my favorite moments in Tanakh is that if you read Genesis 16 carefully, you see that Avram and Sarai don't even refer to Hagar with a name. She is only Shivchatech or Shivchati, your maidservant or my maidservant. And then when she runs away from Sarai's oppression, she meets an angel in the wilderness. The angel's first word to her is, amazingly, Hagar. It's an unbelievable moment. And then, of course, at the end of that story, She says to God, Ata el ro'i, you are the God who sees me, or maybe the God of vision. Same idea. Something so, and she is the only biblical character, she's the only character in Tanakh to give God a name. And it's a slave woman who is seen by God and named by God when no one else will see or name her. That's a physical need in the sense that emotional needs are also physical ones, but it's not a physical need. It's about being seen, which is everything, and so hard to quantify. And that's not a bad description, I think, of a core piece of what it means to try to grow in love, which is actually to see people, and especially to see people who are usually unseen. That's who the God of Israel really is.
Thank you so much. I think that really beautiful closing justified the need for everyone to buy your book. I have just put a link to it in your in the chat. And as you noted, you weren't talking about politics, but politics, domestic and international politics and relations dominate so much of our minds these days. I think the whole world could use a big dose of your book. So let's all do our best to inject some more love into the world. That sounds so cliche, but I don't know. I'm just gonna go with the idea that that's kind of at least partially the point of the book, to build a world where we can all spiritually, physically and spiritually flourish. Thank you so much for teaching us today. It's really a privilege and a pleasure. We are so tremendously proud of alumni like yourself. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We hope you will join us next week also for a completely different session. Dr. Leah Garrett, who is a graduate of the Kekst Graduate School, will be teaching a session on her book, which is called X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos Who Helped Defeat the Nazis. So we hope to see you there. For now, thank you so very much again to Rabbi Held for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you all.